Yeah, but they had to
and local board members.
by them together, so we know where they are. I thought that's
Apologies. I will move the apologies for Councillor Denise Lee and Member Honeck for absence and Councillor Darby for lateness on council business, Cooper and Hulse member Taiperi and Walker for lateness as well.
I'll second that.
Seconded. Move. All those in favour? Aye. Thank you. Anyone have a declaration of interest? No. That's good. Confirmation of the minutes. We have a mover for the minutes of the 21st of March. Councillor Simpson. And the 30th of March. There's two documents. Councillor Cashmore, thank you. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Right, just so we just make sure we're clear on the order of business, we do have a petition, then we have public input from 3 people, and then we have on the agenda local board input, but I'm going to move item number 10 to follow item 5, which is the public input, because obviously a lot of people in the audience are here to
Second.
listen to that debate. So, all good? So, Sam. Aotearoa 350 or 350 Aotearoa? Please introduce yourself, and you know you've got 5 minutes for the petition. So.
Does that 5 minutes begin now?
No.
And then questions. Yeah.
Right, okay. Kia ora koutou. 350 Aotearoa is presenting to Council a petition of 2,056 people, which will be delivered electronically this afternoon. When I found out about global warming when I was little, I was struck by a sense of urgency. The picture I had of the future being a stable continuation of the past was gone. I learnt that the sea would eventually rise and take over my home, eventually forcing whole cities to relocate. I imagined migrants trying to survive living on boats. As I grew up, the threat of climate change grew with me. I learnt that the unprecedented advance of the human species was causing an unprecedented dysfunctioning of our atmosphere. Not only was the sea rising, but we were on track to face ever stronger cyclones, drought that would destroy life over vast swathes of the earth, and some areas would become too hot for human life. It's hard to believe that we've travelled this far down the road to extinction. The biggest reason this is happening is because coal, oil and gas are continuously being extracted from the earth and burnt for energy, sending carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. The potential carbon emissions from the coal, oil and gas in the world's currently operating fields and mines would send us beyond 2 degrees centigrade of warming. This is the point of no return. If you're in a hole, stop digging. From this point in time, no new fossil fuel extraction or transportation infrastructure should be built. We must conduct a managed decline of the fossil fuel industry and ensure a just transition for the workers involved, many of whom will build the clean energy infrastructure that will keep the lights on tomorrow. But the likes of ExxonMobil, Anadarko and Total, all companies that Auckland Council has been invested in, do not share the foresight shared by many around this room. These companies are determined to continue investing in new infrastructure that will have us burning and extracting fossil fuels for decades to come. In the interests of our children, of their children, and of poor people the world over who are suffering first and will suffer hardest from climate change, we must stand up and denounce this as wrong. We need our council to cut its ties with the industry that won't stop until we have perished. We are already surrounded by the signs that our climate is losing its balance. The eastern regions of our country, Canterbury, Marlborough, Wairarapa, Hawke's Bay are becoming arid. When it rains, the rain falls harder. This is destroying our homes, it's eroding our soil, it's overloading and damaging our infrastructure. What the North Island faced last week was only the vestiges of Cyclone Debbie. If we look to our poor neighbours close to the equator, they face the prospect of ever stronger cyclones. These cyclones will destroy their homes, they will destroy their infrastructure, destroy their crops, and tear their vegetation to shreds. Last year's Cyclone Winston was the strongest cyclone to hit the South Pacific Basin in recorded history. The fossil fuel companies that Auckland Council is invested in are planning to let more and more of this happen. They refuse to change what they do.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
Consequently, our city should refuse to be involved with them. We are asking Auckland Council to follow the lead of cities like Melbourne, San Francisco, and Dunedin and make a stand. The global divestment movement is sending a powerful signal to the world's institutions and decision makers that fossil fuel companies do not have the social license to continue doing what they are doing. In the end, this is about shifting the political climate. It's about getting us one step closer to keeping fossil fuels in the ground and to a world powered by clean energy for everyone. With the support of 2,056 Aucklanders, we are asking Auckland Council to do two specific things. 1, freeze all new investments in companies whose primary business is fossil fuel production or extraction. And 2, divest all holdings from investments in companies whose primary business is fossil fuel production or extraction within 3 years. Our unborn descendants are calling out for us to act. I'm asking you to respond to that call and take up the step that all the people behind us are imploring us to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, well done.
Questions? Oh, well,
That was good, sir.
questions may be coming to the others. Well, Sam, thank you for the petition. It's going to be presented online this afternoon. Yeah. Okay.
I'm happy to
Yeah.
second or move, Mr Chair. then.
Councillor Hulse will therefore move, and seconded by Councillor Hills, that to receive the petition, which has now disappeared from my screen. We received the petition from 350 Aotearoa relating to Auckland Council's responsible investment policy. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Right, we'll now go to public input, and we have Dr Richard Milne, the convener for the
Thank you,
Auckland
Dr.
Anglican Climate Action
Whole
Group
team.
regards responsible investment policy. Welcome, Richard.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Put in,
Thank you for the opportunity to present today. And thank you also for making available the responsible investment recommendations from your consultant CAER. I've been an Auckland City ratepayer for 34 years. Professionally, I'm a consultant health economist with an academic appointment at the University of Auckland. Personally, I'm a long-standing member of the Anglican Church and the leader of a group that has been working for 10 years in educating church members on how to live more sustainably, especially with regard to energy use and the threat of climate change. The Council's consultants advised that companies whose business is extraction of fossil fuels should be excluded from investment. I'm here today to support that advice in general rather than specific terms. As we know, oil and gas are necessary to our city's infrastructure and to public and private transportation, which is a major issue in Auckland. If we stopped using them today, we wouldn't go home tonight. Some of us might walk, but perhaps most of us wouldn't. Fossil fuel companies already have far more fossil fuel reserves than they'll ever be able to burn. If we're going to keep global atmospheric temperature rises under 3 degrees, let alone 2 degrees, a safer level. For many reasons, including climate change, health and social justice, scientists advise us that we need to switch to renewable energy sources as fast as possible. New Zealand has a commitment under the Conference of Parties COP21 in Paris 2015 to reduce the carbon emissions that are destroying our planet. In practice, a massive shift from dirty energy to renewable energy is already underway and accelerating rapidly. For example, large solar installations in the Middle East, the very producers of oil, are now producing energy more cheaply than oil and gas. The shift to clean energy is causing big investment dislocation, such as the collapse in thermal coal prices in the US, which led in recent years to bankruptcy of large mining companies, Peabody Coal and Arch Resources. We must conclude that investors run a serious risk of stranded assets, such as oil, gas and coal reserves which have been discovered but can never be burned. This could and will mean poor returns on investment and losses for institutions that keep their investments in oil, coal and gas, as your consultants have pointed out. The London Stock Exchange, among others, already requires companies listed on it to disclose their exposure to carbon, and the Bank of England requires that lenders report their exposure to carbon, indicating the degree of risk that is perceived. Worldwide, universities and churches are leading the fossil fuel divestment campaign, as they did on tobacco and apartheid. Also involved are some of the very largest sovereign wealth funds, notably the Norwegian one, which has begun a staged divestment from fossil fuels. In New Zealand, Victoria University, Dunedin City Council and the Anglican Church have already divested from companies whose major business is exploration for or extraction of fossil fuels. In 2014, the General Synod of the Anglican Church, which is the whole governing body for the whole church in New Zealand, decided to divest from fossil fuels, and within 2 years, major trusts, Anglican trusts, had divested. It can be done, it certainly is underway. The annual expansion of new renewable sources of electricity now exceeds that of coal, natural gas and oil combined. This represents major reinvestment opportunities for the Council. So it's not just about divestment, it's about reinvestment as well. Fossil fuel exploration and extraction is a sunset industry, ladies and gentlemen. We need to reinvest in clean, renewable energy as rapidly as possible for both moral and financial reasons. I congratulate the Council for commissioning external investment advice. I support that advice. I would encourage you to consider the practical investment advice that my colleague Dr. Robert Howell will provide for you shortly. One of the leading intellectuals of today, Noam Chomsky, has said that the two most serious issues facing the world today are nuclear war and climate change. Many years ago, Auckland Council declared Auckland a nuclear-free zone. This might have seemed foolish to some of us at the time, but it made an important statement to the rest of New Zealand and the rest of the world. Can we declare Auckland a fossil fuel divestment zone? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Richard. Very good. Questions? Councillor Walker.
So, are there any, wonderful presentation, are there any, through you, Mr. Chair, are there any things that you would suggest we bolt on to the resolutions that we're putting in terms of their adequacy?
Can I defer that question to Dr. Robert Howell, who has more practical experience in this area than I do? Thank you for the question.
Well, no further questions, Richard. Thank you very much. Really
Thank you.
Appreciate the so I'll move a vote of thanks to receive the presentation, and seconded by Councillor Fiso Collins. Thank you. Members, all those in favour?
Aye.
Thank you. Is Gareth here? Yes. Yes. Welcome, Gareth. Introduce yourself. It's election year, please.
I won't ask for party votes here, but look, kia ora, ngamihi nui kia koutou, kia ora. It's wonderful to be here. I think I'm looking around the table with a bit of jealousy. When I head back to Parliament this afternoon, I'm going to have to put a tie on. So, as Phil will know, it's nice not to have to wear a tie. But look, thank you for the opportunity to say a quick few words in support of the petition and support of the recommendation as you look at revising your responsible investment policy. I want to acknowledge you, Mr Mayor, and all the councillors. I think it's a great opportunity for Auckland Council to show real leadership As we just heard from the Anglican Church, who were leaders when it came to divesting from the apartheid movement in the 70s and 80s, nuclear weapons, tobacco, Auckland Council, as it has in the past, can play an incredibly powerful role as part of a global movement, something which I say is like our generation's nuclear-free movement. I want to start by looking at one of the world's top-performing sovereign wealth funds, and I think as New Zealanders we should be proud because it's ours. It's the New Zealand Super Fund, and they've found, and I quote, responsible investors must have concern for environmental, social and governance factors because they are material to long-term returns. It's good to be joining you today to discuss divesting from the manufacture and development of controversial weapons, of tobacco, of gambling machines, and generating revenue from them. If you do this, you're joining a list of banks, funds, cities, universities, churches who have divested for ethical, but importantly, for financial reasons. I'm the Green Party spokesperson for energy, so I'd like to confine my comments to fossil fuels and climate change in particular. I think it's fantastic you're revising your policy, and after we saw some public questions around tobacco investments, and now that you've withdrawn from the Janus Fund, you can say you aren't investing in cluster munitions, nuclear or other controversial weapons, but there is a question on fossil fuels, a question of investing in the companies we heard from the Generation Zero speaker, Total, Anadarko, ExxonMobil. I guess I come with a bit of a blunt message. There's no future for us if there's a future for fossil fuels. The scientific consensus is we can't afford to burn 70 to 90% of the stuff we've already discovered if we want to avoid the 2-degree runaway climate change tipping point, if we want to give our kids a safe and stable climate future to grow up. I'd point to the documents and acknowledge the CAER report. In Appendix 2 you talk around substantial investments. I would urge the Council to withdraw all future investments from all fossil fuel businesses where that's their primary business. I would secondly urge you to divest. It's not a good look for the Council to be investing in the likes of Anadarko. It's particularly when you've passed strong and inspirational motions around the risks of deep sea drilling. Auckland's the capital of the Pacific and, as you know, is the largest home to Pacific peoples in the world. What we're talking about today isn't just symbolic. It's not just a bit of paper. It's about our neighbours, looking after the people on the front lines of climate change. Some of the poorest and most definitely the least responsible for the problems we're seeing. The answer is to pass this revised responsible investment policy. It's the right thing to do. It's about being on the right side of history, but it's about financial sense as well. I think it's another expression of your commitment to Auckland 2040 plan, the Low Carbon Auckland and C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. We know the issue of stranded assets and the risk that as the world moves away from fossil fuel production, we could be left with bad investments. But I'd also like to point out what our own super fund has said, which is, quote, overall, there's strong evidence that companies that do well on environmental, social and governance metrics tend to perform better. More specifically, companies with strong ESG, or corporate social responsibility, ratings tend to have the following features: a lower cost of equity and cheaper borrowing costs, better corporate performance, higher profitability, better market performance and higher stock price than less well-rated companies. They say the strength of evidence is now quite compelling, and that's backed up with the CAER report. Look, I don't think there's any compelling argument around not moving away from investments and divesting from existing ones. I think it's inspirational, and I think New Zealanders and Aucklanders can get behind the vision that Auckland's joining cities such as Melbourne, San Francisco, Dunedin, Copenhagen, Washington DC, and divesting from fossil fuels. I think they want to feel proud that that $320 million investment isn't going towards affecting the least responsible, the people on the front lines of climate change. And I think they would like to know that those investments instead could be going towards better public transport, clean energy, smart, high-tech, productive enterprises. So in conclusion, I'd urge you to pass it. Please make sure we're not talking about just substantial investments, but all fossil fuel investments. Do it because it's the right reason. Do it because it's being on the right side of history, and do it because it makes the best financial sense. Kia ora.
Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you, Gareth. I don't know whether you've got to read all of the material. There's quite a lot of material there, Gareth, but you're probably familiar with a lot of the language there. There's a suggestion that we should caveat divestments to funds or or companies where they are greater than 10% materiality in a particular, say, area. So, they might be 90% in making chocolate, but they're 10% drilling off the west coast. I'm probably of a view that we need to strike out that materiality 10%, and I'll be proposing that. But what's your view? Is there a threshold, or is it a shut out and make a clear message as opposed to an ambiguous message?
Well, I think for simplicity's sake, for efficiency, for ease of use, you want to have as simple and clear as possible. I'm not an expert on the global divestment movement, but I'd urge you to look at what those other cities have done with their funds. I think what people want is not a wiggle room, as it were. I think what people want is a clear statement, and that's what I think you have the opportunity to do today.
Thank you.
Mr Walker.
Just picking up on Councillor Darby's comment around the 10%, is it conceivable that you could have an international company that the fund we're investing in, that while it might have less than 10% commitment in a given area, if part of that 10% was investment in New Zealand, it could be a huge and significant investment around fossil fuels, for example. Is that conceivable?
Oh, absolutely.
There's no one else, so thank you, Gareth. And there's a vote of thanks received the presentation.
Happy to move,
From
Mr Chair.
Gareth and moved by Councillor Walker, seconded by Councillor Collins. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? All right, we have one last presentation. Dr Robert Howell regards investment policy review as well. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. Acknowledgements to the Mayor and councillors. I have recently published a book, Investing in People and the Planet, and in that book I include considerations of definitions of responsible investment, how to select an ethical fund, best practice, shareholder activism, divestment and reporting. In your report, which is in Appendix 1 by CARE, it recommends that you consider the concept of ESG, and I argue that this is an invalid measure of responsible investment. To quote Jolly, who was one of the co-chairs of the expert group of the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, he did a study after 2008 about companies that had signed up to the UNPRI and those that hadn't, and he found that there was absolutely no difference. So this concept of ESG that's been recommended is a very inadequate way of defining what is an ethical fund or an ethical investment. The steps that you should go through to select an ethical fund: define your values, decide what types of investments that you don't want to invest in, negative screening. Sometimes that can be positive screening, the companies that you do want to invest in. Thirdly, you need to choose the way in which you engage with companies and funds. And fourthly, you need to describe the reporting that you expect the fund to carry out. In my book, I discuss a number of funds around the world and recommend that the principles for an ethical organisation should be modelled on the Norwegian Government Sovereign Wealth Fund for the principles and practices with some modifications. Shareholder activism. Regardless of the principles and exclusions adopted, there are some companies in any portfolio that are unethical when human and human earth responsibilities are considered. Engagement is a process whereby advocacy with companies, often through AGMs, can persuade changes to be made. Examples of successful shareholder activism include helping bring an end to apartheid, persuading general electorate to take climate change seriously, and encouraging Nucor, the largest steel producer company in the United States, to use iron that was not produced with slave labour. Divestment. When engagement fails, divestment is the next option. I don't have time to go into this in detail. I would support the arguments that have been supplied by 350.org, Richard Mill and others. But I would simply point you to the Mercer Fund that was in part funded by the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, which includes that major risks to financial returns for staying in the fossil fuel sector, and particularly in the coal sector, those risks are very considerable. So over time, if you want to stay in that, you'll lose your shirt. Reporting. Last year, I referred the council's unwillingness to disclose the companies that they invest in to the Ombudsman. A final decision is awaited, but I remain unconvinced that hiding the information is unjustified and that there are plenty of ways of receiving expert advice and still maintaining public accountability and disclosure. So therefore I recommend that the council consider the Norwegian Government's Sovereign Wealth Fund principles and practice with some modification as the best model to follow. To follow an ESG approach would be to adopt an invalid, outdated and limited approach. It would not give Auckland ratepayers the confidence that best practice is being followed. Secondly, the 4 steps for selecting an ethical fund, as briefly described above, be adopted. And thirdly, that the council adopt a course that allows for a full disclosure and reporting of the funds and companies that it invests in and the actions and results of any engagement that it carries out. Thank you, Mr Chair and councillors and Mayor.
Councillor Walker.
Sure. So you've looked at our appendices at what we're proposing in terms of a draft. Robert, do you consider there's any difficulty in making some modification to incorporate the changes that you're suggesting, and that we consider that and conceivably devote some time to that?
I think you need to review the broad principles and policies that define what it is to be a responsible organisation. I think that needs work.
Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I'm just on the internet trying to find a little bit more information about the Norwegian government's sovereign wealth scheme. Are you able to just summarise, what's the main differences, why you like that scheme and why you're asking us to consider it?
You have to ask about the UN Principles of Responsible Investment, the ESG approach. What is it about the environmental practice is wrong? What about the social impact? What is wrong about that or good about that? If you're looking at governance, what constitutes good governance? The UNPRI never defines that. The only moral term in the UNPRI and the ESG approach is the word responsible, which is undefined. So what one has to do is go to principles underlying that and define exactly what it is that is unacceptable in terms of the way a company behaves towards its shareholders and its stakeholders, the impact that it has on the environment. And you can do, there's a variety of ways that do that, that the Norwegian Parliament has adopted 4 principles which define that, including corruption. It's not in this paper because I don't have time.
Yeah, okay.
But in the paper I also discuss the Swedish approach. What they do is they say they commission their ethical council and the 5 big pension funds to say, look at the Swedish government's, what international agreements and treaties and so on it has signed up to. If it's signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, then that should be taken into account in considering which companies we want to invest in and so on. The only problem with the Swedish approach is that there's no international treaty on tobacco. So, but it's a very interesting approach to give you the sorts of indications that can do that. But I don't really have time to do that now.
No, that's been very helpful, your answer anyway. Thank you very much.
Councillor Lee.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Can I ask you, are you aware of where these investments the council holds came from, the background to these investments?
well, in discussion with officers, we asked for the council to tell us the companies that it was invested in. And there were funds that had been engaged by the council on the condition that that information was not disclosed. Okay.
And what I'm asking, maybe I should explain then, that the funds for these investments are cashed up public assets of the 90s from privatisations, government-required privatisations. What has been invested in whatever company around the world used to be the biggest bus company in New Zealand called the Yellow Bus Company. Landfills, regional landfills, which were sold to multinational rubbish companies and so on and so forth. That's the source of those investments, and like you, I'm not aware of the details of what are responsible and what are not, but I can tell you this, and it may be assuring on one level, the council will get rid of all its investments and spend the money, responsible or not responsible. That's the plan. So, you know, in a few months' time, there won't be anything left to worry about, because this council will flog off the lot.
Well, that's, at the moment, that decision hasn't been made, and until as long as that happens, then you need to act responsibly. But I would also say that as an organisation, you provide opportunities for your staff to invest in KiwiSaver options. Now, there are very few KiwiSaver options who actually divest from the fossil fuel. There are a limited number. The requirement, when staff join, the requirement is that they select their KiwiSaver fund, but there is a default option, and about 1/3 to 40% of staff generally throughout New Zealand go with the default. So my question for you is, what's your default option for KiwiSaver? Does that actually, are those KiwiSaver funds responsible? So even if you divest, you still have a responsibility in terms of that regard. Does the council have a bank? Yes, of course it does. What does that bank do? The 4 Australian banks are all irresponsible. There are a variety of ways as a responsible organisation that you have in terms of bank and insurance companies. So my point is that just divesting is not sufficient. You really have to just go through those 4 steps and follow it through as a consistent organisation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Right, well, there's no one else. Thank you, Robert. Councillor Walker, sorry, Robert, we have one more supplementary question. Last one.
Would it be fair to say, Robert, that what the Auckland Council does in respect of its policy is very significant, because it's the largest council in New Zealand by scale and probably provides a lead to other councils in New Zealand, and aside from the government is probably, is it not the most significant organisation in a public sense?
What can I answer to that? But yes, of course. I mean,
so we need to get it right.
I think that it behoves. I mean, the New Zealand Superannuation Fund provides the lead in some respects, but it's still not an ethical fund. It is invested in things like Rio Tinto, which has a terrible reputation for its abuse of its staff and its stakeholders, as well as the environment. So there are aspects about the New Zealand Super Fund that really need to be changed, and its charter, its legislative charter, is terrible. It really needs to be changed. So, but on the other hand, it has taken some interesting initiatives in terms of climate with the part funding of the Mercer thing. It's getting out of fossil fuels purely on financial grounds, not moral grounds. It needs to actually change its moral charter. And that's why I say I would recommend the council review what it is to be a responsible organisation, and it's the investments are just part of that process.
Thank you, Robert. We have a mover and a seconder. Councillor Fletcher, seconder, Councillor Newman. Sorry, yeah, happy to second.
I am.
Second, it's fine. Batavri, thank you. Thank you, Robert. All those in favour?
Aye.
Right, as mentioned earlier, we're going to move item 10 up to in the agenda. So.